we're all struggling to keep up with this, frankly. And I think also from the government's point of view, and it's hard for serving ministers to say this, but so much of the development is happening in the American private sector that there aren't always the sort of levers that you can pull. And you see this with something like the online safety bill. You get into very controversial territory, and actually you end up being behind the curve in terms of the way in which the technology advances.
There are lots of people who will be listening to this who think, well, AI is just chat GPT. It's a bot. I can put something into it. It will give me something back. It doesn't really affect my life at the moment. Is that true, do you think?
I think it helps to look at these things in chunks and in timelines. For most people at the moment, visibly, it will be things like chat GPT, and some people might find that helpful. It will do tasks and they might otherwise have to do themselves, or they might have to pay for. There are other things which might lead to unseen improvements for people in terms of medics' ability to detect and prevent and treat disease and so on. And AI is just a term for a whole load of activities of advanced computing and engineering, which involve autonomous machine learning. And it will affect everything from our security, our collective security, our individual privacy, our economic opportunities. And there's no one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with that from a public policy or security point of view. So we do need to break it down into what's immediate, what's going to affect us most now, and what are the big long-term opportunities and risks.
Well, let's try and do that, shall we? Because I suppose the first question is, how is AI being used by bad actors, rogue states, or even states that we interact with, all of us, on a daily basis in a way that worries you?
Well, again, I think let's break it down a bit. Firstly, there is a race for supremacy in AI, as there is in all forms of advanced technology, between the American-led West and China. However, I think in terms of some of the more apocalyptic scenarios, such as, out of control killer robots and so forth, China is the ultimate control society, and it has even less interest in out of control AI than we do. So when, for example, people in the West are calling for pauses in the development of AI, there's some merit in that. But one of the arguments against it is that China would sort of seek to use that gap to accelerate its advantage. And that might happen economically, but in terms of sort of, building up sort of lethal autonomous capabilities that it can't control, I'd be somewhat skeptical about that argument. So there's one area about how all this integrates with military capabilities and so forth, and how to ensure there's human, democratic in our case, but in China's case, sort of leadership control over the technology. There's another set of issues which is really current and present, and a big challenge, which is the integrity of information, particularly in Western democratic rule of law societies, because AI is now making it much easier to fake things, much easier to spoof voices, much easier to look like genuine information, much easier to put that out at scale. So having a sense of what is true and reliable is going to become much more difficult, and that's something that risks undermining the fabric of our society. So we need to have a look at that. There will be issues in terms of social cohesion as well, around how you ensure when you're doing things like AI in the criminal justice system and public services that you avoid. Now, the way in which you deal with that are completely different, and I think that's why governments need to take a balanced look at this. They need to get with the industry experts and the academics and so forth. They need to test this. And I think actually hype doesn't help. We saw this in cybersecurity a decade ago, 2 decades ago. Everybody was warning about apocalyptic consequences of our dependence on cybersecurity in a way that could cause large-scale fatalities. We now know that's not the way cybersecurity works. We need to take a balanced and responsible approach to these risks.
I want to break down just those two things that you've pulled out there. Let's leave the killer robots for a moment, and let's talk about the security question, because that's the one that lots of us will have a much bigger impact. Security of information and this kind of technology. Is government in this country doing enough to prepare and to protect the country and all of our data and information from this kind of technology at the moment?
I think the government is doing what it can reasonably, but it's early days, and I think we're all struggling to keep up with this, frankly. And I think also from the government's point of view, and it's hard for serving ministers to say this, but so much of the development is happening in the American private sector that there aren't always the sort of levers that you can pull. And you see this with something like the online safety bill. You get into very controversial territory, and actually you end up being behind the curve in terms of the way in which the technology advances. Now, there have been, I think, since the sort of shock, if you like, of ChatGPT and the growing visibility of AI, there's been a sudden acceleration of sort of regulatory discussion, particularly on the integrity of information. So in the US, President Biden, Vice President Harris and President Biden dropped in, held a major summit with some of the AI leaders. The EU is looking very heavily at this. The UK is sort of involved in some of these conversations, but I still think they're in the early mapping stages of how to get around this problem. And the big question that we haven't been able to answer yet, and that's because it's a really hard question, is how do you get technological markets to work in a way that validates information credibly and in a sort of economically efficient way. So is the government doing enough? I mean, you can make a case that it isn't, but it's partly because it's a really, really difficult challenge.
Okay, and just to take that first point again, that the killer robots in China, I suppose it builds on what you've just said there too. Is there a need for some kind of global charter to try and work out how to regulate this, all of us together, all the countries of the world?
So that'll be very difficult, because the one thing we don't have in any form of decent supply at the moment is trust between the different blocks. However, I do think that China in particular will not want this technology to be introduced in a way that's completely out of control. But there's no mechanism for doing this. So I think for the moment, what we in the West need to be doing is taking each application of this technology as it comes. As a good example, we could go through loads of warnings from loads of prophecies from 10, 15 years ago that by 2020, there would be no longer any drivers on our streets. It would all be autonomous vehicles. The fact is, we haven't been able to work out how to use autonomous vehicles safely at scale. So there are very few of them around. I think that pause is a good thing. So we need to think about the same way about the new applications of these technologies militarily and medicine and so forth. And we are capable of doing that. Pause where necessary, develop the ethics, the legal framework and so forth before the technology is introduced. And I think if we do that, we'll be able to introduce it in a way that commands public confidence over time. And who knows what happens geopolitically over the next 25, 50 years. There may be scope to do that at global level.
A little bit of hope there. Kieran Martin, thank you so much for taking us through all of that.